We are in a new study, and I didn't change this. We are really in the lesson called Picnic tonight, and that's me being frivolous. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens, and I kind of want to dig right into what's going on in the lesson because it's a very interesting lesson. I like this quote very, very much. Oh, let me go back. See, here we go. I like this quote very, very much, and partly because of who it's from. Amy Jo Levine is an amazing rabbinical scholar who teaches New Testament at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And I've had the opportunity to hear her lecture and stuff like that. And Amy's just this pretty amazing woman. And she's got this wonderful book that she wrote with a colleague of hers, Douglas Knight, called The Meaning of the Bible, which I highly recommend. And when they're talking about what's going on in Exodus, they said something that has just sort of rested in my spirit for a long time, and it really comes into play here. Talking about the God Yahweh, I will be who I will be. I am who I am. That God, they say this deity whose name is a verb, and that just has been really speaks to me. With this God of Israel, the God that we embrace as Christians, his name is not a noun. This God's name is a verb. I will be who I will be, is manifest not only in mythic time, like all other gods on the Mount of Olympus, in all the other mythos, in the Egyptian myths. This God is also manifested in the here and now, a God who is present, to the point that the rabbis talk of this God, instead of saying God's name, they say present, the presence, the presence. This God is present in the here and now and in relation with the covenant community. And tonight we're going to really see how that relationship plays out in the covenant community. And I see that there's a comment, and I can't, y'all, I'm just too multitasking here. So you're gonna have to talk amongst yourselves so Shay can get here. But there is this whole idea of a God whose name is a verb, is present in the here and now and in relation. This all of Exodus leads up to this moment at Sinai, right? And this idea of it being a summit. Sinai is a summit experience in the Exodus. And it begins with this wonderful idea of the revelation, because even though it's called Horeb earlier on in the Exodus text, the mountain is identified as Sinai. And this is where Moses on the side of the mountain. And Wilbert, I've been thinking a whole lot about your comment about, we're going to talk about this tonight, Moses up and down and all around the mountain, right? Going up, and sometimes he's up and sometimes he's down, and he has to go here, and sometimes it's necessary for him to come down and necessary to go up. And so it's this interesting idea of watching Moses's travels up and around the mountain, right? So you have Moses here in this idea of this burning bush where he is on the side of the mountain, and then he comes off of the mountain to go get the people. Then we flash forward to Exodus 19, and coming out of Exodus 19, what happens is we have Moses, and it's time for negotiation and God and getting settled into the community. And Moses goes up the mountain and he meets with God, and then he comes down the mountain and he tells the people, this is what the plan is. We're going to mark off this mountain, and God is up at the top. I'm coming up. I'm going up to the mountain to meet God. You all, we're going to fence this in so your community is all ready down here, and we'll be in touch with you and let you know what's going on. And he does that, and then he goes back up the mountain again to meet with God, and he comes back down the mountain. There's all of this sort of up and down going on. And then we get into chapter 20 where we get this decalogue, or this offer, where God says, these are my terms of the agreement. And this happens when Moses is on the side of the mountain. And then last week, we had all of the case law, where we got into the situation where there is this understanding, kind of breaking down what these 10 ideas or these 10 principles are in all of the case law, and what you do in terms of managing slaves, in terms of correcting ills, in terms of all of the different ways managing property, all of those things, the case law. And this was delivered on the side of the mountain. Remember last week, though, I told you that we believe that this text was was inserted later whenever there was a need to try to explain really all of this, and this text came later. And what you're going to see in tonight's reading is that it's already been read and pronounced in the text, but in tonight's chapter we hear that Moses recites it or tells them about it, and then he reads it and he writes it down. So this book of the covenant, this deal, this fine print, comes in and resurfaces a number of times tonight. And so now we get this agreement where God calls Moses up the mountain, but before he comes up the mountain, he says, well, make sure you get the people all squared away and make sure that all of this is all settled. And then they go back, they go up the mountain, they come back down, there's a while where Moses is on the side of the mountain with Joshua, and then he's called back up again. So there's all this movement around the mountain. And we're going to see why that's important and why that is significant in the process of understanding what's about to happen on the other side. Because on the other side of tonight is where we figure out how we replicate what this mountain means in the terms of building. This is the mountain of God. This is where the covenant is issued from. But the children of Israel can't live by the mountain. So they're going to have to move on. And they devise a way to take the presence or the abode of God with them. And so all of August is going to be about moving on and getting this place built where God can reside and travel with them. So that's all part of this mountain thing. I'm going to look at the chat real quick to see if there's anything that needs to go. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. So in the middle of all of this, we sort of have these this sort of thing that's happening here. What's really important to remember is that this covenant is unique. It's built out of a different kind of material, if you will, than earlier covenants. There is the covenant that God makes in Genesis with Noah that says, okay, I will never flood the world again. That's the first covenant. There's the covenant that God makes with Abraham. It says, I will make you the father of many nations. Your children will be like the stars. The word that's used there that's translated as covenant really means to establish. It's a unilateral. God is making a promise. There's no sort of requirement that is necessary for these covenants. Abraham, I've decided to do this through you. This is what's going to happen. Noah, I'm not going to let this happen again. This is the way this is going to be. It's God establishing a policy, if you will, right? But this Sinai covenant is drawn on an agreement, and the basis of the agreement is a mutual understanding, a love that is going to exist between this God and the people of God. And the word there is karath, and that actually means to cut, which is very interesting. It's like, why would that word be translated as covenant? Because this goes into an ancient, not just a Hebrew tradition, but an ancient tradition of covenant that happened in all of the ancient Near East countries, from Egypt all the way to Babylon and beyond, that when a covenant was entered into, there would be a feast. There would be a meal that would sort of seal the deal. And there would be a sacrifice that would be made. And the sharing of this common meal would mean that there was an understanding between these two parties. That's what, remember if you back when we were doing the Lent study, when Dr. Terrell kept talking about the common meal. That is what this is. And so the word karat, to cut meant that you would take the animal and you would cut it in pieces after it had been sacrificed. And that word becomes the word in Hebrew that means a covenant, an agreement in this case to love. In Deuteronomy, the other place where we find the Ten Commandments and the story of the Sinai narrative, in there you find something, and that's, now I'm going to see if you get a little ring of familiarity here, because what happens here is, this is what Moses says after he's gone through, these are the 10 sayings, these are the 10 things that God wants you to do in chapter 5. In chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, this is what we hear. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God is the only true God. So love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Memorize God's laws and tell them to your children over and over again. Talk about them all the time. Whether you're at home or walking along the road or going to bed at night or getting up in the morning, write down copies. Tie them to your wrists and foreheads to help you obey them. Write these laws on the door frames of your homes and on your town gates. What is happening here is that it starts with love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength. Does this ring a bell to anybody? Where else have we heard that?
The Jesus's
Great commandment,
something
right?
yeah.
Yeah, where Jesus just says, what's the most important law? Everything hangs on love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength. He throws mind in there. Your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength. And the second one's like it, love your neighbors yourself, which comes out of Leviticus. He pairs those together. But he's going back to the idea that, so in his day, the Pharisees, in our day, the legalists, in Moses' day, many, or in later Judaism, a lot of rabbis were all about the law. And this is where this whole tension in the tradition begins, is whenever you focus on the law, you turn God sort of into an ogre that's a judge, right? This is not a loving God all of a sudden. This is a punishing God. This is a God that, and now we are all afraid of this God. And there's all of this sort of language and emotion that builds up whenever you're looking at this as laws, as opposed to understanding that this is a God of love and that this arrangement is a love connection. Tone, you got something?
Yeah, it's sort of like it's sort of like a messed up, sort of like not a messed up, but sort of an antithesis of like the lionization of God, where we portray God as this like vengeful, sort of being, when that's not what God's supposed to be. It's sort of like with the katana, the Japanese sword that the samurai used, where we sort of praise it. It's like this like lightsaber of swords, but really it wasn't really the best sword because unlike many European swords, it didn't really have any bend, doesn't have any give. Therefore, if it's bent, it's going to stay bent. That's sort of like with God, we sort of like we do this all the time with everything. Like with God, we just sort of like portray him as like this vengeful. And I even said before, like and there was this meme I shared where I said, but this pastor said, I sent it to you, I think, where he said, if you preach a vengeful God, people were like, okay, yeah. But if you start preaching a loving God, people are like, they get uneasy.
Isn't that wild? It's so true, because there is this idea that we have been conditioned to expect that first of all, that what God requires of us is so impossible that we are just sinners forever, right? That there's
same thing with Jesus.
Yes.
Same thing with Jesus. Like we like, there's this meme, like I think I shared it with you also, Tim, where Jesus was brown, all loving, like all accepting, and loving to people. Jesus was not white, American, and hateful.
No.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
I'll say it before and I'll say it again. Jesus was not white. He was not European. He was Middle Eastern.
Yeah.
He was from Israel. Israel is in the Middle East. Israel is not in Europe. Therefore, Jesus was from a Middle Eastern people.
You're exactly right. So this idea of this God of love, when we think about all of the laws, and we look at it, and when I was a kid, okay, I'm going to draw a terrible parallel, but when I was a kid and I watched the Wizard of Oz, remember that when they get in to see the wizard, and the wizard is this huge head, and there's all this smoke and fire, and the great Oz has spoken, and the lion, the cowardly lion, runs down the hall and jumps out the window. Remember all of that? There are a lot of people who envision God the same way. And what's interesting is that the awesomeness of this God, who loves these people so much to enter into a love connection with them, into a covenant of love that is sealed with a love feast, with this meal, which we'll get to in a minute. This they want, and trying to portray the awesomeness of this God, the writers of Exodus give us smoke and fire and voices thundering off the mountain and everything. They're trying to show us how extraordinary this God is, how beautiful this God is, how amazing this God is, that this is a God that would get involved in my story and would love me. This is the present God. I will be who I will be. I am present. And it's so awesome for them. They create this God of such spectacle, because it's like, this is not a God who can be contained in an idol. This is not a God who has a face. There's all of this conversation in this chapter about they saw God, but God didn't hurt them, because God is so big, God is not even supposed to be seen, right? All of this is happening. And what we've done is taken those things and turned them into fearsome images. You understand what I'm saying? So now it is, we've turned this God of smoke and fire and thunder into something that's frightening, something we're supposed to be afraid of, something that we're supposed to like worry about, who is going to hurt us, right? And that's not what this is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and strength. Memorize God's laws, not because if you don't know the laws, you're going to go to jail. Memorize them because this God loves you and has given you this guidance, this has put you into this agreement that is going to be healthy and life-giving for you. And so that's why this idea of a covenant, which I love, nobody enters into a covenant. Let's just be real. If it's not if the deal doesn't work for you, you wouldn't sign up for it, right? I mean, who does that? Who's like, okay, I'm going to buy land in I'm going to buy land by, and I know that there's chemical waste and that's going to make me sick. Nobody runs out and buys that land. No, Jeff, you're a realtor. You could never sell that. I know you can sell anything, but you couldn't sell that land, right? You couldn't do that. Think of your job. Think of what you would be doing in your life. Nobody ever would agree to do something that was bad. So how could this covenant work? Because we're going to see in this chapter, it's not a covenant until the people agree to it. This is not like God saying, this is how it's going to be. That's earlier in Genesis. Here, it is an agreement, and it's a love-based agreement. And that makes it a most extraordinary thing that's happening on this mountain. Tone? So we get, where did he go? Yes, Tony. No, nothing? Okay, gotcha. Then we get to, I got to move everybody around because I can't see my whole screen when I'm doing slides. So so we get to Exodus 24, 1 through 2, the first two verses. And you know what? Let me see. Chris, do me a favor. I'm just going to go down the list. Everybody's going to get called on to read tonight, I think. Chris, do me a favor and just read the text that's in the blue box.
Yeah. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of Israel's elders, and only worship from a distance. Only Moses may come near to the Lord. The others shouldn't come near, while the people shouldn't come up with him at all."
There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. And so I want to point out a few things. First, I want to go back. I'm serious, Wilbur, that comment that you just made in passing has messed with me every time I look at it. It just keeps messing with me, because I think that it's a wonderful thing for us to recognize about the nature of our engagement with God and our engagement with living, right? Which is this notion that life is full of, you're always traveling and you are moving up. And sometimes you feel real close to God. And there are times whenever you feel like you're on the other side of the fence, down at the bottom, wondering what God is saying and what God is doing. And I really want us, as we think about the geography of this mountain, to think about it that way. Sometimes you're just stuck. I love there's 6 days at the end of this chapter where Moses just stuck on the side of the mountain waiting to know what to do next, living in a cloud. He's just living in this weird cloud. I don't know what's supposed to happen next. And so there are moments when that's what life is like. There's moments when you're down on the side of the fence feeling like I can't even break through to get to God. Then there are other times where God says, come on up, just come on up. And so there's this interesting way that all of our lives mirror this behavior. It is a way of understanding that if anybody tells you I'm close to God every day, I just don't doubt they're close to God at all, because that's an exaggeration. You know, I think we spend our lives trying to stay close to God every day, but there are some days when I'm going to tell you the truth, and I would imagine, you know, if people were, if I could see your faces, you'd all nod along. There are days whenever I don't feel close to God at all. There are some days I want more. I don't know where God even is. Where is this God? What is this thing? You know, there are days whenever I feel so all alone, I don't know what to do. Right. But that's when I'm at the bottom of the mountain. And there are other days where it's like, oh, come on up. Okay, I'll just come on up, see what's going on. You know, let's check this out. And so there is this idea of Moses is all over the mountain. He's not in this elevated state all the time. And he's got with him his brother Aaron, who initially is called a prophet, but something's happening to Aaron's role here. And Aaron and his two sons are moving into more of a mediation kind of a point. Aaron is going to be in the middle here. He's going to come up, but not be able to go all the way with Moses. Now, remember, initially they were shoulder to shoulder, right? They're side by side in front of Pharaoh. They're dancing together on the other side of the Red Sea. But now Moses is moving up and Aaron's hanging back a little bit with his sons as sort of in the middle ground. And you've got these 70 leaders. If you know it, there's a lot of math in the Exodus. I've spared you guys some of it, but there's a lot of math in the Exodus. And one of the big things is 7 is one of those big numbers. 10 is a big number. That's like there's something very important. Sit up and listen. 10 is kind of this idea of a laws or engagements. But 7 is always the perfect number. 7 days in a week, right? The 7th year is the Sabbath. 7, 7, 7. You know, 70. Every 7 times 7 gets you to a jubilee. There's all of these 7s. So you take 7 and multiply it by 10 and you get 70. This is a perfect delegation. This one less wouldn't be enough. One more would be too many. This is the perfect number. And then God tells them to worship. And I love the word that's there that means worship really means to just bow down, to just be like, I can't even stand. The presence of the Lord is so great. I can't stand. I'm going to lay down and prostrate myself in your presence, in the presence. This word, by the way, that we see for worship here is a word we've already seen in Exodus 20, where it says, do not bow down to idols. It's the exact same word. You stand up if you're around an idol. You don't get down on your knees. You don't bow down. And then we get into this idea of mountain zones and where I will be. And I want you to sort of pay a little attention to this, because this is going to come into play. What the writers are doing is really ingenious here, is they're setting the stage for the next, and the next couple of weeks is for like, it's an interior decorator's heaven, the next couple of weeks of studies, because it's just all about how you decorate and where the drapes go and where you put the gold, all this kind of stuff, right? But it's setting up an abode for God that mimics this idea. There is the summit of the mountain where it is pure presence. This is where God resides. And this is access for the prophet. The prophet can access this space, but no one else can come into this space. This space is going to be reflected in what's called the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. The Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God resides there in the tabernacle. And then you have this middle ground where there are the priests, the sons and the elders, the people who are in the middle, the mediators, they are able to see the presence of God. I just think it's kind of a comic moment. And they saw the presence of God, and lucky for them, God didn't get rid of them. You know, it's just like but they are engaged and able to see there's a visible presence. And then at the base of the mountain, the people have a sense, an audible sense. They also see the fire and all of that on the mountain, but they hear these commands. They hear this voice of God. They hear and they are able to have an audible experience of God. In the temple and the tabernacle, you have this inner sanctum, this Holy of Holies, where there is inside there the Ark of the Covenant, where the presence of God is said to exist. And then you have this middle ground where the priests work at the altar, And then out of there, you have what's called the court, where the people are. And so this space is going to be replicated. What happens vertically on this mountain is going to be happening horizontally in the space, the worship space that Israel is going to create for itself, which is, to me, is kind of fascinating. These folks didn't miss a beat. I'm just telling you, they didn't miss a beat when they were putting all of this together, right? And so what you're getting to see already in these first two verses is an emerging priesthood, just an emerging priesthood, because now there's got to be somebody in the middle ground of the mountain. There's always got to be somebody there who's kind of working between what's happening at the top and what's happening at the bottom. And that's where this idea of priesthood gets born. Now, what happens in Christianity is because what happens on the cross, according to the Gospels, when Jesus dies on the cross, the veil that separates the Holy of Holies from the common people, what happens to that curtain? Does anybody remember what happens? It gets ripped, torn apart. So now it's all open. And the writer in Hebrews says there's a new and living way that entrance to the very throne is made available to all of us. That's why we talk in Christianity about the priesthood of all people. Everybody is a priest. Chris, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I was thinking back to I think that one of the earlier slides where you were using that kind of description of God as a verb. And I think in this section as well, in that kind of worship and practice. And I think Kabbalah talks a lot about this, of kind of that mystical kind of practice of God being a verb, where, you know, kind of our practice of love is us acting out God, or our practice of justice is us acting out God, and this God doing thing, as opposed to God doing things at us,
or to us, right?
Or to us.
Yes. No.
It's how we practice Godness.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Which goes back to this notion of us all functioning as priests, right? We're in that wonderful in-between space, you know, which is I don't know what verifying OneDrive means. I don't know what that means. Anyway, in the middle of everything, there is this idea that we are always the doers. So that the temple has been all of this segmentation, this segregation of the temple that is set up in replication of this mountain is now wide open to us. That's the fundamental Christian idea. We do God. God doesn't do things to us. Our actions are the embodiment and the presence of God made real in the world. That's beautiful. And so, so we are verbs too, right? Tony?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you said about the priesthood, Tim, with everyone, with how we all have the capacity to be priestly. It's just like how, like, in the Ghost of Tsushima game, there was that one mission I mentioned where we have to find an abbot, but the abbot wrote there was one line where the abbot wrote saying that we all have the capacity to be Buddhas. We're all capable of being Buddhas.
And that's that same idea, right, of embodying the very nature of the divine. Yeah. Let's look on and see where we go here. There's a lot here. I'm going to spare you all the hassle. How's that? Unless somebody wants to volunteer to read all of this text. Does any volunteers to read? Gabe Wilbert's got it. Good.
Moses came and told the people all the Lord's words and all the case laws. All the people answered in unison, "Everything that the Lord has said, we will do." Moses then wrote down all the Lord's words. He got up early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain. He set up 12 sacred stone pillars from the 12 tribes of Israel. He appointed certain young Israelite men to offer entirely burned offerings and slaughter oxen as well-being sacrifices to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in large bowls. The other half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the covenant scroll and read it out loud for the people to hear. They responded, "Everything that the Lord has said, we will do and we will obey." Moses then took the blood and threw it over the people. Moses said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord now makes with you on the basis of all these words."
All kinds of stuff going on. Let's just break some of this down. So remember last week's stuff, all that case law, all that juicy stuff that we spent all the time breaking down. Now all of a sudden it's as if this is appearing for the first time. That's what's kind of interesting. That's how we think that these chapters were added earlier, almost like, oh, we've already showed you what the case law is, now we're going to tell you what it is. And so Moses comes and tells the people everything that the Lord has said to him so far. And so this is all the case laws, all of the commandments. Here we go. And I really love the way that Shay kind of led us into thinking about these things more as sayings than commandments. Because what we've got to do is we've got to kind of pry ourselves free of this legalistic idea that these principles of, no other gods before me, the Sabbath, don't kill, all of those principles are part of establishing this ethical community. They are not do this or else, because that's how quickly we go from 0 to 90, right? Do this or else. And all of a sudden it's about us saving our own hides instead of abiding by the principles. Moses comes and says, these are the principles. These are everything that I've heard. This is the way this is going to work. This is what's going to be foundational to our community. And so the people answer, and this is where they enter the covenant. You don't, a deed of property is not complete until the seller and the buyer sign on. Otherwise, the deed is not transferred. A lease is not complete until the landlord and the renter. A contract between an artist and anywhere. No contract is complete until both parties sign on. We have to remember that when we talk about this covenant, the people had a choice. The people ascend. There's an assent to this. They say, yes, this is a deal we can live by. We can abide by these principles. We can abide by the ethics that are set forth in these case laws. And they say, yeah, everything that the Lord suggests here, everything that's in this, we're good with it. We will do it. And we always stop, a lot of us think, for instance, that the Exodus story ends on chapter 20, right? There's the 10 commandments. Oh, and then later on, there was a party with a golden calf later on. And, somehow or another, we get that story told, right? And remember in the movie, if you remember the Cecil B. DeMille movie, it's when Moses is getting the tablets the first time, when he's hearing this for the first time, and come down and whoop, 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 there's a party going on. It's not made clear that these laws have been discussed and mulled over and agreed to. These principles are in effect long before the golden calf thing happens. Okay, we got a ways to go before that happens. And so they say, yeah, this is good for us. And so then he writes it down. Now, there's an interesting thing here, because we don't know what the writers really mean here. We don't know, because there wasn't a lot of writing going on back in this day. All right, but Moses writes this all down, and he puts it together in a book, and that becomes what we now know of chapters 21, 22, and 23 as the book of the covenant. This is telling us that's how that came to be. Those last 3 chapters you read, that's how this came to be. Moses wrote it down. And then he gets up and he builds an altar. This is really important, because this comes out of the Genesis tradition. Any place where you mark an altar is where you are saying God is present. This is a sign of divine presence. This is very, very important. This is the place you go to meet God. When I was a young man, I had spent a lot of time at a church on the South Side, First Church of Deliverance, which had a very wonderful doctrine about the altar, the altar is the place where the spiritual world and the physical world come into contact with one another. This is the place where the world of God and the world of humanity come into contact. And so this is what he does. He builds an altar saying, there's a meeting of minds here. So we're going to mark the presence of God with an altar. But then he's also, that would only be half the story. So he sets up these 12 pillars to signify that the people are here as part of this agreement as well. The people are part of this agreement. And then he appoints certain young Israelite men who are going to become the priesthood class to offer entirely burned offerings, which means this is creating, remember we used this word before, the Holocaust, the creation of smoke that would rise up and would fill the nostrils of God, in as much as God has nostrils, but that's not what, the smoke would rise up, the entirely burnt offerings, and then there are the well-being sacrifices. These are the animals that are slaughtered and then are used for the meal, for the peacekeeping kind of sacrifice, a peace offering, a well-being offering. This is where we're all going to sit down together and eat. And this is the common meal. So you have these two kinds of offerings are being offered up. And then the offering, the blood from the slaughter, he takes half of it and he puts it in large bowls. But the other half, he throws against the altar, which is right about now where it's like, okay, now we've gone into Quentin Tarantino territory, right? Now it's now we're in one of these violent movies. But that was not a unique practice to the people of Jewish faith. This was a common practice, particularly among nomadic tribes in the ancient Near East. When they would have a covenant, they would offer up prayers, and they would throw the blood of the well-being, the peace offering, against the altars to their gods as a sign of saying, you're part of this. We are part of this covenant. You're involved in this covenant. This is the way that we're signing this deal and including you in it. So we are invoking your presence, and then we are including you in the peace part, the well-being part of this deal, not just the smoke, but you get some of that. And then it says, he took the covenant scroll and he read it out loud. So now they've heard these words, he's written them down, now he's reading the words again. And they respond again, but they say something a little different this time. Everything the Lord has said, we will do and we will obey. What's interesting here, the word actually means we will listen, we'll pay attention, we will be mindful of these things. It's not just, we're just not going to do them out of, because he said so. We're going to pay attention to it. We're going to heed what these principles are and live by these principles. And then he takes the blood and the scripture says he threw it over the people, which is just like, ooh, yuck. What's that? What's that? I've got my Sunday best on and you're throwing blood at me. What is that? What all the scholars seem to agree on is really what that means is he did not throw this all over the congregation. First of all, it would only hit the people in the first couple rows, right? He doesn't do that. That's kind of an inadequate way of doing it. What they're saying is the suggestion here is really that he took the blood and threw it against the pillars that represented Israel, those 12 pillars, that he finishes it. So you've got the altar on one side, the pillars on the other, and now they are both covered in the blood of this peace offering, this covenant of peace, of us living together. And Moses said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord now makes with you on the basis of all these words. The words that comes from God in the case studies, the words that come from the people. Yes, everything that the Lord said we will do and we will obey. It is now a covenant. It's a sealed deal. I want to stop for a minute there because I'm wondering how many of us are in some way intrigued by the notion that this is a little more of an equitable deal than maybe we had been taught or thought it was. I was always raised that these 10 commandments came off the mountain and that was it. We're done. You don't really have much say in the matter. But that's not what this scripture says. You have a say in the matter. This is a voluntary agreement made between two parties. not equitable necessarily, but these two parties are joined together in this covenant. And symbolically, with the way that the blood is sprayed on the altar and the 12 pillars, symbolically and audibly, they are in agreement. Tony, did you have a thought there? Chris has got his hand up.
Actually, yeah, it's sort of. I was know it, but actually, yeah, because I was remember that I let me see, I didn't raise my hand. I'm sorry, Chris, sorry, but it's kind of interesting because like we often like you and Shem make a point of saying how like in the commandments say like that you shall have no other gods before me, but what's interesting is that in a lot of ways we should have accepted that because did like them to recognize that there are other deities because these were not an isolated people. These were not
Right.
like this is not North Korea. These were not an isolated people. They traded with the Greeks. They traded with like the Arabs who at the time were heavily polytheistic. Islam wasn't even around yet. You have so many peoples around the Near East. It would only make sense that they would acknowledge the other pantheons.
Yeah. And so there is this awareness that you're not bound, this is, you don't owe obeisance to anybody else. When you're in this agreement with me, we're sort of in this one-on-one thing. This is just the two of us, if you will. There's a song, I think, there. Chris?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to when I was in Malawi, in northeastern Malawi, and where you've got the border with Tanzania, in that area of Malawi and in Tanzania, marriages are signed in blood.
Mm-hmm.
In traditional religion, marriages were signed in blood, and the two families would do that blood signing.
Mm-hmm.
So as kind of Christianity came in, that tradition continued or continues,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of takes on a pre-existing kind of blood covenant between two families,
Yeah.
and uses and quite often uses this reading.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting that they go back to this. But we're going to see how that in a minute, we're going to see how this thing takes on a life of its own and is continuing to sort of play out in various and interesting ways, even in today's ideas and today's culture, certainly in Christian churches, but in other ways. But this idea of that but it's really important that we realize that the blood is not, the blood comes from the offering that is going to feed and nurture the community, right? The blood does not come from punishment. The blood comes from the goodwill offering, is how it's called in some things, or the peace offering, or the offering of well-being. Eat this and you'll be nourished, right? So this animal has not been slaughtered for no reason or just for symbolic reasons. It has been nourished so that all the sides who are in this agreement can eat. And so the blood comes from a very particular kind of meaning, that it's not just let's just get some blood. And so it's interesting the way that works. I would imagine, Chris, that whatever blood is used, whatever animals are used to get the blood, that those animals are part of the wedding feast. Would that be?
Yes, it will be the blood from either the goat or the cow that forms the wedding feast. And so in that, in a very, very kind of similar vein,
mm-hmm.
that kind of wellness offering, and it bonds the two families together
Forever. That's right. That's what this is. So you see what's beginning to happen here. Yeah, and so that's kind of the interesting thing about the way this story takes on its own sort of life, right? And so they go up to the mountain. Let me see. Jeff, you want to hit this? Can you see what's in the little blue box here? Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu. Boy, what names, huh?
Okay. Yeah. So then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and several elders of Israel went up and they saw Israel's God. Under God's feet, there was what looked like a floor of lapis lazuli tiles, dazzlingly pure like the sky. God didn't harm the Israelite leaders, though they looked at God, and they ate and drank.
Isn't that amazing? I love this idea that they go up and they see God, but it doesn't really sound like they really see God. It sounds more like they can look up through God's floor. And this is the way that the Hebrews Bible is explaining why the sky is blue. Because the tile where God lives is the color of lapis lazuli. Some places it's translated as sapphire, and it's translucent. They can see up into the heavens. So what is up? When we look up into the heavens, what do we see? We see stars and planets and all of that, right? So it's by nature a translucent thing that they look up in, but they see God, but God doesn't harm them. And that's very, very important, because this is a God that cannot be framed as an idol. This is a God who has no face. This is a God who has no image, right? This is because they are an anti-idolatrous people. But yet this idea of, so how do you see God if God doesn't have a recognizable form? And so they say, well, we sort of saw God through the floor, through the skylight. We looked up through a skylight and had a sense of who God is. Now, what's very interesting is that the writers here are, when we see this God in this chapter, it's the God Elohim, the God of the heavens, the God who is above all company of all gods, not Yahweh, not the I will be who I will be in this passage. So they're kind of easing up, because they are firmly committed to the idea that this I will be who I will be has no form at all. This is a God who is pure presence, who is not, there's nothing to see. This God is invisibly present in everything, always with us across all time, the way we would envision God, or the way we think of God, God as this presence, more as a being. And so they use the other word for Elohim here, and they look through God's floor. And then they do the common meal. We talked about how this word covenant means to cut and to sacrifice. And if you took a minute to read the email that I sent out for this week's lesson, there's a deep connection between what happens here on this mountainside and what Jesus is doing with the disciples in the Last Supper. Notice that he does not say there's the new covenant in the bread. What does he say? This wine represents the new covenant in my blood. This idea that the promise that Jesus is making to be with us always, that there is a promise that God is going to, has taken on the form of Jesus, and in Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, we are saved or redeemed, we are rescued. That promise of rescue, that deal is cut, and Jesus says, it's cut in my blood. And so Jesus, and when he's talking to a whole group of Palestinian Jews and says, this is a new covenant in my blood, they are not just thinking about Passover. The Passover ritual is different. This is the new covenant in my blood. This is on par with what God did for us at Sinai. What's happening here is a new version of that agreement, a new version of that agreement. That's why Jesus also is very big about everybody supping and eating with him at the dinner, right? That's why they're eating together. This is a new covenant meal, is what's happening there. Now, Chris already scooped this a little bit, but all of this idea spills over into the reason why we have wedding receptions. We don't have a wedding reception because we all got dressed up and we want to have a party after we've sat through a 30-minute service and, and listened to Because You Come to Me with Not Said Love, or whatever the wedding music is. The reason, and we want to go dance and drink, we have a wedding reception because historically, when a covenant is entered into, it is finalized with a meal. And the wedding reception, let's think about, where does the cut happen in the wedding reception? We don't in America, in Europe, we don't sacrifice goats and stuff. Where do we do any cutting in the wedding reception? Can anybody think?
The cake.
The cake. The cake gets cut. The cake has been around since Roman times, when they decided that they would not replicate this whole sacrificial thing, but instead they would use a cake to celebrate, but they still cut the cake, and it was still incumbent on the couple to cut the cake. How's that, y'all? So that beautiful wedding cake, that's just sitting there as a substitute for a goat. How's that? That's the whole point of the ritual, to cut, because when that wedding cake is cut, the meal is finished, the deal is sealed. How's that, Tony?
Well, I mean, cake is made from dairy products, and goats have been used for dairy products. So
Maybe there's some goat in the cake. There you go. Yeah. I would imagine if I were having a cake, I would want some of that good goat cheese in there somewhere anyway, right? I'm a sucker for goat cheese. But next time you're at a wedding and you see that whole business of, oh, they're going to cut the cake, they're going to cut the cake, they're going to cut the cake, you just know that really what they're doing is they are replicating a sacrificial act that in the old days would result in the father of the groom's father taking the blood and sprinkling it all over everything. It's a fascinating thing, huh? We don't know where this stuff comes from. So yeah, the Romans decided let them eat cake instead of go in the other direction. Then we get to these tablets. Finally, the Lord says to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and wait there. I'll give you the stone tablets with the instructions and the commandments that I've written in order to teach them. God's going to provide the final copy of the signed treaty. Now God has signed, literally signed the paperwork. Here's the deal. He only gives it to Moses, and we're going to see in a minute, after he makes Moses wait. And then he says these things are going to be a teaching tool. That gets lost. So often it gets lost in our understanding of what's on those tablets. This is a way of instructing the people, a way of guiding them through life, of giving them an ethical set of boundaries and guidance and grounding. I'm gonna keep banging on that because we just have to get ourselves out of this, if you don't obey the rules, you're going to hell thing. These are guidances. This is the way you teach the people. Now, here's a little bit of nerd business. I've already hit you with the cake. That I really shouldn't hit you with one more, but here you go. The tablets that we have found from this period on which laws are written look exactly like this. They're about between 12 and 16 inches. That's all they are. They're not terribly big, and they're etched, and they are rectangular. Now, we are all used to seeing, I was going to put a picture up, close your eyes and see your Bible storybooks of Moses. What do the tablets look like? Remember what the tablets look like? They're huge, right? And how do they look? What's different than this? How do they look? Close your eyes. What are you seeing? They're round on top. They're round on top. The rounded tablets on top is a very, very, very late development. It's a very, very late development. It comes even after Roman times. It's not until much later that people begin to round off the tops of these steles and tablets. And so, but we have taken it, medieval artists were more familiar with the rounded ones because they were more recent. And so every time they painted Moses, they put, 5th century tablets in Moses's hand instead of 8th and 9th century, earlier tablets. So it's just an interesting little bit of things. Well, if you close your eyes now and you want to get an image of what Moses probably looked like when he had these tablets, you should understand that he's carrying little short ones, about big enough that he doesn't have to hold them like this. He can just tuck them under his arm, bring them on down. So that's sort of the way, that's what the writers are envisioning. Then we get to the mountain. And this wraps us up. So Moses and his assistant Joshua, notice how Joshua keeps popping up and we don't know where Joshua comes from. Joshua just sort of pops up. Joshua's at that battle. Nobody knows who Joshua's down there fighting the battle. And we've never met Joshua. We don't know who his parents are. We don't know how he knows Moses. But Joshua, his assistant, shows up. You know, it's sort of like that the devil wears Prada kind of moment, right? You know, here's Joshua, and he comes to help Moses, and Moses went up God's mountain. Moses said to the elders, y'all wait back here until we come, and Aaron and Hur. Now remember, Hur, we don't know anything about Hur outside the fact that he always his name was Aaron. And the last time we saw Hur was during that battle with the Amalekites, where there were the two people that held up Moses' arms. Remember that? That was Hur. So Aaron and Hur are going to be with you. And whoever has a legal dispute, if you got a problem, y'all go see them. Go see Aaron and Hur. And then Moses goes up the mountain, and a cloud covers the mountain. And the Lord's glorious presence settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. So Moses and Joshua are living above the cloud line on this mountain. You know, I live on the 42nd floor of my building, and there are some days when the clouds drip so low that I'm just looking at cotton out my windows, that because the clouds are lower than my apartment, right? That's where Moses is. He's in a place where the cloud has descended on the mountain, and he lives in this cloud for 6 days. And on the 7th day, the Lord calls to Moses from the cloud. Now to the Israelites, the ones at the bottom behind the fence, the Lord's glorious presence looked like a blazing fire on top of the mountain. But they know that is the presence that they're seeing. They know they're not seeing God's own self, the presence. So Moses entered the cloud. So he's in this cloud, but now he's entering the cloud and went up the mountain. And here's the funny part that people always want to skip. Then we got to put a pause on this. Moses stays on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days and 40 nights. Does that sound familiar? Where else have we seen 40 days and 40 nights? We go through 40 days and 40 nights every spring, don't we? 40 days and 40 nights of Lent, because Jesus spends 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. How long was Noah on the boat? 40 days and 40 nights. This 40 days and 40 nights is always symbolic of a kind of a time of refining, a time of going into a crucible. Moses is doing some very serious self-discovery up there in the presence of God for 40 days and 40 nights. And I kind of feel sorry for Joshua. Bless Joshua's heart. He's just stuck by himself on the side of the mountain wondering where Moses is for 40 days and 40 nights. That's a little bit of a while to be there. Any thoughts? Any surprises? Anything that you didn't see coming, or things that you might have thought that kind of are clearer to you now? How about the way that all of this keeps connecting back into the Christian narrative? You notice how they just seem to borrow these moments and these symbols and these numbers. This is also why so often in the Gospels you'll hear people say, who do they think I am? Some say you're Moses. Remember that? Some say you're Elijah. Anything else? Anything else we need to talk about here? Y'all good? Wilbert, you don't have anything tonight?
Well, I was thinking about something, but I think it's later in the story. Because I had some thoughts about the tabernacle, but I think that's later.
We're going to get all in the tabernacle, yeah. But go ahead and tease us. What are you thinking?
Oh no, when you had mentioned about the curtains being torn and all of that, I started thinking, well, the whole tabernacle seems to be a metaphor and symbolic of Jesus coming to earth, and I think of the torn curtain as his torn flesh, and even the tabernacle itself almost being somewhat of the maybe even the body of Jesus. And I don't know, I started seeing a lot of parallels there.
There's a lot of beauty there, isn't there? Yeah, in the way that all kind of builds into and on itself, right? And when we think about what the understanding of the first Christians, who were all out of the Jewish tradition, their mind whenever, and this is why Paul doesn't, what does Paul say? Don't you know your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit? There is this idea of embodiment actually being its own tabernacle. Yeah. And then you have all the ways that the tabernacle is arranged in replication of Sinai. But what's the big deal about Sinai? It's the mountain of God. That's where God dwells. It is the abode of God. So back to Chris's point about us doing love and this God who is a verb and us being made in God's image, and we are verbs, we are also embodiments of the presence of God, right? So it all, yeah, that's beautiful. It all kind of comes together. Edie, did you have something? You flashed in for a hot second there.
It's covered. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Any other thoughts? Tone?
So Chris and I were talking about this like in the chat earlier on. So it's about do you know the Solutrean hypothesis, Tim?
No, I don't. No, that's why I didn't jump into it when I saw it.
Yeah, so Chris, so I think Chris, can you help back me up with this? Chris, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Can you help back me up with this? Because I usually try to explain as best I can, but I might get a bit, temperamental. So can you help back me up?
I'm not sure where you're going with it, Tony. So
No, you run with it, Tony. We'll help you through. Go.
Because we were talking about like Jesus, if Jesus was white or Middle Eastern, and this hypothesis is that the first Americans were originally from Southern Europe, from Western Europe. And I read this like funny video thing where like we were here first, and then the Asians came in to kill all the.
That's one of those preposterous kind of white supremacist ideas, then.
Yeah.
Yeah. We don't have any space for that. Yeah, we don't have any space for that. That's crazy. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean,
we're wrapping a little early, which I am just happy with. I owe you guys so much time that I've taken other time going over that I'm happy to pay some of this back. But are there any final ideas or anything that we want to think about? Does this framing of the covenant kind of add more depth and meaning to your understanding of our Eucharist and communion rite? Does that kind of help give it a little more dimension? Because in the liturgy, and I always kind of like skate around the liturgy a little bit. It's not the way that it would be if we were in a full-on Presbyterian church and I was reading out of the Book of Common Worship or something, right? But there is this notion kind of gets buried in what we say the Eucharist is, but so much of the attitude and the concept that Jesus is borrowing from there is saying this is a new covenant. That's so important. And it's a word that particularly Protestants like to kick around a lot, covenant, but we don't understand that covenant is not just God promising something to us. And I often talk about that as a promise, but it is a promise that we then agree to accept and to be guided by, a new way of being. And that's what's happening here on the side of the mountain. That's what Jesus is doing in the room during the Passover ritual, where he's actually going beyond the Passover. He's moving out of the Passover and taking their minds to the Sinai. It's a very interesting move. It's a very subtle kind of move that he does there.
Tim, for me, it helped that you had that Deuteronomy passage as well as the references for Jesus, because this chapter did not say picnic to me.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, but it helped having those other references.
Yeah, and that was me being a little on the ironic side. It's like, yeah, we're going to throw blood all over everybody and slaughter some animals, have a picnic on the side of a hill, right? But that the idea that this is it's a love arrangement, it's a love connection, and that is one of the things that separates Israel historically from all of its neighbors, because remember, all the other neighbors that are idolatrous and polytheistic and all of that, they are always trying to appease their gods. Their gods live separate lives. They live on Olympus. They live in the sky. They live underground. They live in the mountains. They live in the forest. Their gods are always around them, but not part of their own stories. And their engagement with the god is to just try to make sure the gods don't get angry and send earthquakes and fires and floods and all that kind of stuff. That's the appeasement of, and all the other religious systems that are around Israel in the ancient Near East are all about appeasing these gods. Whereas Israel says, first of all, we're not going to have a bunch of gods like, you know, the God of the harvest and the God of the this and the God of the that. There's one God. And this God, it takes them a while to work that math out, by the way. But this God is a God who loves us, and we are in a bond of love with this God. So when Jesus evokes this idea with the new covenant, he also has already declared his love. He says in the book of John, I've loved you with an everlasting love. There's this kind of idea of this no, people will know you're my disciples if you love one another. Jesus is rehearsing a lot of this language of ethic and love in that conversation as well. And I'm wrong about I love you with an everlasting love. That's elsewhere. But anyway, the idea is still present. Tony?
Yeah, is that what you were saying about, you know, like a God who like would bring wrath upon humans and like would bring flooding? That's pretty much what kami are in Japanese folklore and Shinto, where you have these beings who do have limits to their power, but are also not inherently good either, and kami, just because kami are basically manifestations of nature and can bring in joy but also destruction. We have to remember that like Raijin and Fujin are two examples, because Raijin would compete with each other, because Raijin would bring massive rainstorms while Fujin would have a bag of winds and they would create hurricanes. But even then they were believed to be benevolent because they would bless the land with crops each year.
See, well, and Tony, I think you're touching on something. You triggered something in me to think about how often we revert to. We say as people of faith from whose roots are in this tradition, we still will ask, why would God do this? Which is the mindset of people that believe you've got to appease gods or else bad things will happen. You see, this is loving a relationship with a God who is present means that we are vulnerable to everything that is in nature. Thank you, Tony, for that point. We're vulnerable to everything that's in nature, whether it's illness or catastrophe. We are vulnerable to that, but the God who is present is with us in those things. That's an entirely different construct than trying to fix it so that God doesn't rain judgment and, you know, all this kind of stuff on. You see what I'm saying? And so that's a pagan mindset. When somebody would tell somebody you've got cancer because you haven't been faithful to God, and that kind of stuff gets said, or God's going to, you know, it's no wonder that he died early. He was a sinner. That's pagan kind of thinking. That is not at all acknowledging this covenant that is born and bred and strengthened and sealed in love, in a love feast, right? So it's much different. Look, Walt and I have been together. It'll be 30 years in September that we've been together. We've been through some hell together. We have been through some hell together. I could tell you stories, okay? But we went through it together, and that's how we knew that was the test of our love, that we went through it together. Not that Walt saved me or I saved Walt. It wouldn't be right for Walt to say, hey, you know, how about that? Why didn't you save me? That's not that's a pagan kind of religion, right? It's a pagan kind of relationship. A love relationship is, we're just in this together. We're in this together. Whatever happens, we're going to get into this together. We're going to get through this together. You'll do your best with what you can. I'll do my best with what we can. We'll get through this together. Which is why when people start saying, why would God do this? That's a different kind of God. That's not this God. Does that help you? I mean, does that make sense? We so often want to play both sides against the middle. We want this loving God, but then we want to blame God when things go wrong. Well, can't do that. Can't do that. That's not how it works. If God loves us, God is with us, right? God is present. I will be who I will be, not I'm going to be afraid of me. That's a different idea. That's a pagan concept. That's not the terms of this covenant. How's that? That's a good way to end this night, I think. Thank you all for your faithfulness and your support. We are moving into live stuff. We now have big monthly expenses. You all have been faithful for the season, so we're not hurting. But at the same time, we'll just continue to keep working and moving toward that. And we're going to be adding Rachel to our payroll as a part-time director of community life as soon as she's recovered, so that all the stuff that I'm trying to do, I can take off my plate and spend more time in real ministry instead of trying to keep track of everything. So that's the blessing there. So she'll be coming on. We're growing, y'all. And it's because of your faithfulness and your care and your prayers. So just want to thank you. And next week, we're going to move into the tabernacle, which then takes this picnic that's not a picnic and turns it into a movable feast. How do we take this covenant and turn it into a place I'm just serious, the next couple weeks, get ready. It is really, it's interior decorating is all it is. And so we'll be looking at why these things are set up this way and what they are meant to symbolize and how they are constructed in a way to keep this experience of this week central to the community, even as it travels through the wilderness. Amen. God, we are so grateful for this time together, for your people, for this word, for this community. I pray that you will take us from this place, but keep us in one another's hearts and always in your presence. We stand in the cloud of your presence always, God. Be with us now as we go forth. Give us a good weekend. Give us a good week ahead. Be with us, God. Keep us and make us mindful of those that are in need around us. Let us call their names daily in our prayers. And we will give your name the praise for all that you do in, with, and through us. Amen. Good night, everybody. We will see you all next week. Thank you all. What a wonderful time. It's always so good to see you. Good night.